Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jessica Wilson, Executive Director of New York City Audubon. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's lecture, the second in New York City Audubon's Winter Lecture Series. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. As you saw when you joined the Zoom is being recorded, but don't worry, attendees aren't going to show up on the screen. Your videos and mics are all off. Throughout the conversation this evening, you can submit questions by using the Q&A function in Zoom, which is likely located at the bottom of your computer screen. We'll take questions at the end of our panel discussion. We've also turned on closed captioning for the Zoom for you to follow along. And we'll be sharing a recording of the Zoom with captions with everyone who registered later this week. For those of you who are new to New York City Audubon, we are a grassroots conservation nonprofit that works to protect the city's wild birds and their habitat across the city. We do this through research science, advocacy, education, and outreach. One of our education programs is this Winter Lecture Series, with 5 monthly lectures on a variety of topics related to urban birding and conservation. A big thank you to Claude and Lucienne Bloch, whose generous and longtime support of the series has made tonight's lecture possible. We have a very exciting night planned for you all tonight with filmmaker Jeff Kimball. Jeff is a producer, cinematographer, and film editor. He's also done significant work as a music supervisor. He founded the music department at Miramax Films, where he worked on the score and soundtrack for more than 100 movies, including the Oscar-winning Good Will Hunting. He's made several documentary films and is currently serving as executive producer for a feature documentary highlighting the historic Icelandic women's strike in 1975. Jeff is active with several environmental causes, including as a longtime board member for New York City Audubon, where he served as board president from 2016 to 2020. But it's his acclaimed film, Birders, The Central Park Effect, that's brought us all here tonight. The film premiered at the South by Southwest Festival in 2012 before being shown on HBO. As you all know, it's a beautiful film about the birds and the people that make Central Park such a special birding community. Though I wasn't involved with New York City Audubon 10 years ago, the film spoke to my heart when it first came out. It was in Central Park where I got my start birding. Many more years ago than I care to reveal on this Zoom, I was a kid growing up in New York City, desperate for nature and the outdoors. I stumbled upon a bird walk led by legendary guide Sarah Elliott, who's in the film, and was hooked. Sarah took me under her proverbial wing. She introduced me to the regulars in the park, both the magical birds and the people who spend time there. It's been a treat to see that experience brought on the big screen, and I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion. I'm now happy to introduce Jeff Kimball to get things started. Take it away, Jeff.
Hi, thank you, Jessica. And thanks everybody thank you to the panelists and everyone who's come tonight, and to Claude and Lucienne Bloch for supporting this whole endeavor. Yes, it's kind of hard to believe, but it's been 10 years, or at least hard for me, the 10 years since the film came out, 10 and a half actually. It was premiered in the summer. So we thought when Audubon asked me we could do something, we could have brainstormed and thought, wouldn't it be fun to have like a little mini cast reunion and talk about maybe how things have changed in 10 years, both with birds and with the park. So I'd like to welcome our 4 panelists besides myself. I'll just read them in the order here: Chuck McAlexander, Chris Cooper, Joe DiCostanzo, and Anya Auerbach. It was suggested to me that I might remind you all of who these characters were in the film. So I'll start with Anya. She was the inspiring teenager who you probably can imagine is no longer a teenager, but is in fact a PhD student in ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Minnesota. I think I got that right. Chris will always be known as the author of the inimitable 7 Pleasures of Birding. And it turns out that our film was not Chris's only foray into bird filmmaking, as he is the star, I believe the star host of a national Nat Geo program called The Extraordinary Birder, which will be released in early 2023, probably about the time everybody's paying attention to the birds returning. Joe DiCostanzo is was the resident ornithologist in the film, who was also one of my birding mentors. So I'm indebted to him. He's been leading bird walks in the park for, I'm going to guess, at least 30 years, maybe more. Yeah, something like that. Something like that. Because I started walking with him 20 something years ago. So and he was a veteran at that point. And Chuck McAlexander is also a longtime Central Park fixture who I met when I started birding with Joe. And he's in the film. He's the intrepid birder who's not only shown making bird feeders, but he's also out. And many people comment to me on this is one of the shots they love in the film, that he's out there on snowshoes, birding by snowshoe in the middle of Central Park, which doesn't happen too often. You do see people cross-country skiing sometimes, but you're the only one I've ever seen birding by snowshoe.
I don't have the balance to ski.
Okay. Before we get started, I'd like to remember a few folks who are in the film but who are no longer with us. Of course, there's Star Sapphire, who was featured very prominently in the film and was talked very bravely about her cancer. Blessedly, she did make it. She did live to see the finished film and was very pleased with it. And as were both her daughters, who came up to me at the funeral service and said how happy they were to have had this document of their mother. And she also got to enjoy being feted by the New York Times when the film came out. So that was a good thing. Harry Moss is also passed as one of the 4 photographers sitting around the table with a bunch of cameras, you may recall, and also a past president of Audubon. In fact, he was kind of my mentor as a president at Audubon. Dick Gershon, another longtime Central Park birder, was also one of the 4 guys at the table with all the cameras. David Berg is in the film. He's the naturalist that explains on camera how Central Park was a totally man-made creation, and even that spigot of water is New York City water turned on and off with a spigot. I mean, that little stream is turned on and off with a spigot. David Berg was also a previous president of New York City Audubon. Irving Cantor he started birding in the park, and Irving also passed quite a few years ago. He started birding in Central Park in the 1930s, and he has a kind of a memorable moment in the film when he explains that when he wanted to go birding back in those days, he had to bring a fishing pole with him because it wasn't manly to go birding. So he and his buddies would carry fishing poles so that no one would think they were up to something funny. And finally, Sarah Elliott, who mostly ended up on the cutting room floor, but I think some of her work is in the film. And as we heard earlier, she was kind of Jessica Wilson's inspiration to get into the park. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to a panel discussion now. And I'm going to start with a broad-based question, and anybody can jump in and answer. I think mostly our focus here is what have we seen in the last 10 years in terms of the bird population in Central Park and in terms of the birder population, both of which have gone through some transformations in the last 10 years. And I realize that Anya's in a slight disadvantage because she's not been in New York City like the rest of us all this time. But anyway, so I'll just throw that out. Joe, maybe you can lead off, being a professional ornithologist, and also I think were you a lifetime Central Park birder, or were you more of a Prospect Park birder, but a New York City birder, put it that way?
Well, I was a New York City birder. I grew up in the center of the universe, which is Brooklyn, and so my initial birding was more in Brooklyn and in Greenwood Cemetery. But I looked up. I've got my computer screen on behind, and you can't see it, but I can. And my first visit to Central Park birding was 51 and a half years ago.
Wow.
And
what did you see besides the obvious?
Well, that was when I got my life common yellow throat. I see, according to my computer list in front of me here, and my life field sparrow.
That's a good one.
And so that was May 16th, 1971. So I've been birding Central Park for over 50 years now.
Yeah.
And so so seen a lot of birds there. My own personal list is 220 species. And I've actually, since the film came out, I've added, I don't know, 30 some odd species to my own Central Park list
Wow.
in the last 10 years.
Well, for
Some
example,
of them
snowy
being some
owls.
really good birds. What?
Snowy owl is probably one of them, right?
Snowy owl's one of them. I mean, some of the other, just looking at my list here for the last decade, some of the noteworthy birds that have shown up in the last 10 years. I'm skipping ones that were new for me, but were undoubtedly seen prior to that in Central Park. But things like Pacific Slope flycatcher, which probably may have been the first one for New York State. Swainson's warbler was not a first for New York State, but it was a very good bird anywhere, and still is anywhere in Central Park. Hammond's flycatcher was also, that was in 2017.
Was that your first Kirtland's, the one that was about 5 years?
I was getting to that one.
Oh, sorry.
That one, that's, we talked somewhat before, in the last week, we've had some emails and about memorable things. And the Kirtland's I might put up there as one of the most memorable, perhaps the most memorable Central Park birds. I mean, that's not a bird that I think any of us ever thought of getting in Central Park. And the whole scene around that bird when it was there, and just the crowds of birders. I remember commenting to someone that someone should tell Grayling, Michigan's Chamber of Commerce that they were taking a significant hit because of this bird. Because I knew people standing there were saying, "Oh, I was planning on going to Grayling, Michigan next year, and I'm not going now." I had been there the year before, so it didn't save me the trip. But Kirtland's has to be one of the big Central Park birds. The snowy owl was amazing. This past February, the slatyback gull.
Oh yeah,
another amazing Central Park bird. And for me, another amazing bird was in April of 2019 when I was just sitting around by the feeders at Vodia, actually waiting for a red-breasted nuthatch to show up because I needed it for my spring list in the park. And I looked down at the ground where all the mourning doves were, and there was a white-winged dove walking around amongst the mourning doves. And that was, I believe, the first county record for New York. So those are, of the last 10 years, those are some of the amazing things we've had in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and Chris, you may be among us. You may be the next longest birding in Central Park, because you were definitely there before I was and Chuck was. So, and Anya wasn't even alive. So,
well, to come back to your original question, what are the changes? Definitely, the birds have decreased in number, and I don't think that's a shock to anybody.
No.
We all know about that happening, but it's painful to see it. The other big change is, with the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, like total collapse of the birding community. A lot of days during spring migration, I felt like I was the only one out there. And then the following year, polar opposite, like explosion of the birding community. Which is really amazing to see, and a lot of younger birders, because as you could probably deduce from the in memoriam you started off with, birding is always skewed older, so we tend to lose a lot of our loved ones, our loved companions, maybe a little bit more. But now there's a lot of new younger birders, so I would say those are the two big changes: fewer birds, more birders. And it's kind of interesting because when you run into those new birders, and a lot of them are like, "Oh my God, this is the most amazing day ever." And I'd say, you have no idea. We haven't had a real wave day in like at least 5 to 10 years. And I remember Irv Cantor, who you mentioned in the in memoriam at the beginning, who'd been birding the park since the 30s. I started in the 80s. And I would say, oh my God, this is a great day. And he'd look at me and he'd say, you have no idea. So it really, it's we laugh about it, but it's sad and it's unfortunate.
And Chuck, you've been birding quite a while.
Oh,
probably have-
23 years. I started right at the turn of the century, I think. Signed up for Joe's group, and he started trying to sort me out, and it failed miserably, I'm afraid.
Did my
As
best.
far as far as changes in the birds, yes, I noticed a pretty serious decline in numbers. That said, the last 3 Saturdays in November of this year were quite good for my group. We had nobody had too much. Nobody could see everything. It was just, we were in some good spots at a good time. Changes in the birders, though, are something that I notice a lot. 10 years ago, we were still carrying field guides. A few of us had cell phones, but not everybody. And now, when you point out a little dicky bird over there, out come the freaking machines, and they're all trying to find it in an app or a picture of it, or they want the machine to identify it for them, or they want to hear what it has to say. They're not looking at the bird more. I think.
But is that
I
any
think it's
different than
really
when we had books, then we pulled the book out? I mean,
well, we did, but we had to look at the bird first. And okay, if we had one we couldn't identify, yeah, then we'd start thumbing through, but we already looked at it for a while. Now, they never put the phones away, really. They're walking around waiting to point it at something, and they're constantly staring at it. It detracts greatly from the experience, but you can't get that point through to them because we're talking about people who are addicted to the machine.
I think this is where Anya should jump in and give us the youth perspective.
Yeah.
Sure, although I don't know if I'm entirely representative. I suppose to first address the immediate point. I absolutely use my phone for birding, but it's mostly to start my eBird checklist at the beginning of my birding outing and then to end it at the end of my birding outing. And I actually do usually prefer to not be looking at it too much while I'm out.
Yeah.
But I mean, eBird as
Well,
a change to how birding works is massive. And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at how those changes over time. You can track them really well through eBird. Certainly in terms of the demographics of birding. It's funny you mentioned that no one was in Central Park in spring 2020. I was actually in New York City in spring 2020. I was between college and graduate school, and my family lives near Riverside Park. So I went exclusively to Riverside Park for all of that spring migration, birding the south of 96th Street eBird hotspot in Riverside Park the entire spring and nowhere else. And, trying to get to the top of that eBird hotspot basically, since I had nothing else to do. But even I've noticed the explosion of birders for sure, and the visits I've had back to New York, which kind of gives me snapshots of how things are changing when I visit New York a couple times a year. I've also noticed how much of a difference that's made in terms of rarity finding. People are finding so many rare birds. There are absolutely fewer birds total. I mean, I believe my elders when they say it, but the number of rarities that people are finding, predictably, given the number of people looking, has gone way up.
Yeah, I was going to actually broaden that out and ask that question. We all agree that the numbers, and even in the 20-something years I've birded, I've noticed the numbers are way down.
Yeah.
But I think that it does feel like the diversity is possibly even better. And I don't know if that's I think Anya hit on something, which is there are a lot more. One of the reasons we all know that Central Park is so good for birding. I mean, it is the Central Park effect. Birds get funneled into the park. But we also know the fact that there are a lot of eyeballs in Central Park. And and with technology and with, GroupMe and all that kind of stuff, when somebody sees a Kirtland's warbler, the word gets out. But that aside, I don't know. I feel like there might be a bigger variety, and it might be climate change. We've got some southern species, coming a little further north, or something. I don't know how a Pacific slope flycatcher ends up in Central Park, but just flies the wrong direction for 3,000, 90 degrees in the wrong direction, I guess. I don't know.
Imagine the difficulty of documenting a Pacific Slope flycatcher before you could take good photos of it, or recordings on
The
your phone.
recordings, and or in that case, people are actually collecting its droppings to do DNA on it.
Did that prove anything?
Yeah, proved it was a Pacific Slope flycatcher.
Right.
Otherwise, I think NYSARC would not have accepted it.
Right.
There have been some changes in some common birds though as well. Common grackle, Joe, you yourself pointed out that was what you considered when spring arrived, is when the grackle showed up.
Yeah,
and now they're year round. They're year round.
Absolutely. When I started birding, as I say, 50 years ago, to me, the first bird of spring was grackle. People always used to talk about the robin being the first bird of spring, but robins were around all year. But grackles left, and they were the first, and they came back usually the end of February. And when the grackles were back, that was the end of winter and the first bird of spring. Now grackles are year round, and they don't leave. They're here all the time. That's part of the climate change and just the general trend of a lot of southern birds moving north. Things like and some of the things that are still uncommon birds that people will still go racing over to see in Central Park. Things like a yellow-throated warbler and prothonotary warbler, and we're always thrilled when we see them. But back years ago when I started, that was, you couldn't figure on seeing either one of those in any given spring in Central Park. Was not, and neither one of those was an annual bird. Now there are multiples.
As they weren't there quite a few yellow-throated warblers this year? A number of them.
A number of them, yeah. Nowadays there are a number of them every spring, and that's not solely attributable to there being more eyes looking. Certainly some of the rarities are definitely a case of there just more people out there looking and seeing, and now things can get documented with digital cameras and your cell phone camera and so on. But some of these southern things like yellow-throated warbler and prothonotary, they're just more of them around now occurring in the spring than in the past because of the climate change.
I agree. I think also, seconding what both you and Anya have said, I think technology has allowed us to compensate for the decreasing numbers, not just in diversity, but even though there are fewer, more people are seeing them because the technology lets us get the word out and all of that. For me, Joe, the bird that has really been the index of climate change is the red-bellied woodpecker. When I was growing up as a kid birding on Long Island, I didn't see that bird until we took a camping trip down to the Carolinas in Georgia. And then, when I started birding Central Park, I was floored that there was one of these in Central Park. And then, they're breeding in Central Park, and they're breeding up into Massachusetts, and I think perhaps even Maine.
They're regular up in New England.
Yeah,
I remember that
in Minnesota, where I live now.
Are you getting them in Minnesota? Yeah. And I remember the same thing, Joe, when I was my early birding years with you. You talked about you actually said, I think you said that there were red-headed woodpeckers were actually more common than red-bellied woodpeckers. That red-bellied was a rare thing in Central Park.
At one time in the past, not by then it certainly had
No,
changed.
I meant like 30 years ago or something, but
30 years prior to that, maybe. But
okay.
Yeah. Tufted titmouse is one that, we all take for granted, though they were kind of scarce the last year or so, but then this fall they've come in again. But that was one that when I started birding was much more of a southern bird of rarity. Though Central Park was one of the few places in the New York City area and Long Island where you could usually count on seeing a tufted titmouse. But past the city, going out into Long Island, there were no tufted titmice. I remember back in the 70s or 80s when there was one on the Montauk Christmas count, and we all had to write it up and submit it for documentation because it had never been recorded at Montauk. Now they're all over. And of course, as I say, it was kind of weird the last year and a half that the titmice had disappeared pretty much from Central, but they're back this fall in numbers.
Yeah, that's cyclical. Well, what about the other direction? Can you think of birds that were very regular or quite common that we basically don't see anymore?
We don't get the northern finches in the same numbers now that we used to.
Purple's pretty rare.
Purple's uncommon, but it's uncommon. It's not rare.
Right, uncommon.
But things like evening grosbeaks and so on, which is an exciting bird now, was an annual bird when I started. You got them pretty much every winter. And I remember seeing, crossbills in Brooklyn and in the city on a pretty regular basis every couple of not every winter, but you could count 2 out of 4 winters you'd get crossbills back then. Now it's maybe 2 out of 10 that you get them locally.
And again, that would sort of be a climate change.
Yeah, the northern birds are just not coming as far south anymore. That southern birds are moving north. What?
Same for pine siskins?
Yeah.
Oh, siskins were much more common then than they are now. Yeah.
Well, there's a reversal of that, and it's not related to climate change, which is really interesting. And I've heard a couple of theories about that, which is the raven. Ravens we never used to have in New York City. Now they're breeding in the city. And I still get excited when I see one in the city, but I mean, they are far more common than they used to be. And that's not a climate change thing, because they used to be restricted to the north and elevation.
And mountain, it used to be in higher mountain elevation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, even though it's gotten warmer, they have spread, into our area and down the Hudson Valley and just sort of all over. So that's really sort of interesting what that's about.
Is that just opportunism, you think, Joe? Or
my own theory on that, on the ravens, is because when I started, my life raven was in the Adirondacks, and when I was early days of birding, if you wanted to see a raven in New York State, you had to go to the Adirondacks.
Yeah,
they just weren't further south than that, at least here. I mean, they were on the Smoky Mountains to the southwest, but they just weren't down this far south. I think I don't know that anybody's tried to document this or study it, but my personal feeling with the raven is that they are a result of the West Nile virus. Before West Nile, we had this crow numbers, American crows, was far higher than they've been ever since West Nile. West Nile seemed to have had a very significant effect on the population of crows in the Northeast. And that population just crashed due to West Nile. And I think the ravens just took advantage of an opening, and the opening of the niche with the crow numbers crashing due to West Nile, and they just moved in and moved south. And that's a personal theory. I don't have any documentation to back that up, but the timing does work out.
I see them up the Hudson Valley now. I go once a week up to Beacon and at the train window. It's all summer long, and also just this past weekend. Raven.
Yeah. I got them on my apartment list regularly now.
Yeah.
I was expecting them to be breeding. I live up in Inwood and in Upper Manhattan, and I watched them carrying nesting material to the big rock structure across the way with the big C for Columbia for their rowing team. And a couple of years ago, I watched them carrying nesting material into a ledge over there. I really hoped I'd have nesting raven on my apartment list, but they didn't stay. But I see them all pretty regularly from my window.
My new apartment in Manhattan, I don't have a view. We just look at a courtyard. So I literally have about 4 different birds on my apartment list. I've only been here 2 years, but one of them is raven. Not by sight, but by sitting at my desk and suddenly I can hear a
Yeah.
raven. It's very distinct.
Yeah,
That's what
but
happened to me.
I fully agree with Chris that raven is not tied to climate change. It's got there's something else going on there. As I say, my personal view is it was related to West Nile and just filling in a niche vacated by the crash of the regular American crow population. But
Well, Joe, I've repeated your theory on that many times with an asterisk saying, no proof, just a conjecture as to what might be the cause. But as you say, the timing is right.
Yeah.
And I just have to second what you said, Jeff. Literally exactly the same thing happened to me in my apartment in the East Village. I was sitting there working away on my laptop and I heard quack, quack. And I'm like, raven! And I went running upstairs to the roof, knocked over a glass along the way that shattered all over the floor. I did not care.
Did
And
you
got
see
up
it though?
there and I saw it.
And you
It
saw it.
did-
Lucky
Did a
you.
nice low loop right over my head. And
Excellent,
great.
excellent apartment list bird.
yeah.
So sort of circling back to the idea of changes in the birding community, and Chris mentioned that, of course, birders tend to skew older, but one of the things that we're very keen on at New York City Audubon is diversity and inclusivity, not just different people, but also different ages, and trying to attract a younger group and other people of color in other communities that are not usually. Are we noticing any more? Are we noticing younger birders? Are we noticing? I mean, I know there's a Black Birders Week now, and there's more of that Latino outdoors. There's more of that. Any comments or thoughts on this?
Well, as someone who's led a couple of Blackbirder Week walks, trying to get more Blackbirders out there, and I've seen a slight uptick. I wouldn't say it's anything monumental. We still have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'd love to see more.
Do you have any in your group, Joe? Any Blackbirders who show up in your group regularly?
Not really. I certainly have had Blackbirders in my group, but it's not regularly.
Not one of the regulars. And Anya, do you notice? I mean, you are the representative of the youth here. Are you noticing more? I mean, when you started birding, how young were you? Younger than the film, I think. Right?
Yes. Well, it sort of started gradually for me, so it's harder for me to put a date on it than it is for a lot of people. I didn't really have a spark bird. I sort of eased into it.
Yeah.
But certainly by the time I was 13, I was birding.
And were you the only one? Did you have buddies?
I was not. I have one very good friend who I made through birding in Central Park.
Mm-hmm.
And she's my best friend to this day.
Oh.
So I guess that's a nice story there. She's a couple years older than me. But other than us, there were not a lot of young birders in Central Park at the time. Certainly, I think we ended up being very close in part because we were not socializing a whole lot with very many other birders in the park. And there certainly seems to be a lot more community now, as far as I can tell. I kind of wish I were a little more part of it, but of course I'm not.
You do feel like there's a lot younger crowd. Yeah. You feel like there is a younger crowd? Yeah.
I mean, that's my impression.
Yeah.
I have a few in my group, but probably the interesting demographic in my Saturday group is it's more Asian than you would expect. Of the regulars that show up almost every week, about a third or some Asian derivation. Mailing list is about 15% Asian. It's highly represented, which I never saw before. I was seeing only white faces. We did have one Black woman in the group.
I've noticed an increase in Asian birder numbers as well. The young people after the pandemic, definitely big uptick. And there, speaking of technology, Chuck, as you were talking about, one of the interesting things I found, and I had to overcome my own bias about this, is that a lot of the young new birders bird only with a telephoto camera. They do or a camera with a telephoto lens. They do not bird with binoculars. And I'm like, how can you bird without binoculars? That's impossible. That's unclean. That's sacrilege.
But
And
they do it quite well.
it works for them. And so, who am I to say that that's not, they're seeing the birds. The thing I find interesting is they learn differently. A lot of them will take pictures of the birds they're seeing, and they don't necessarily, know what they're looking at. But then they will go home and they will look at the pictures and they will consult the relevant texts, break out the guides and all this and figure out what they're seeing, and they'll learn that way, which is different than how you or I learned maybe, but it seems to work for them, which I find very interesting. The one thing I find super annoying, and I'll scowl at somebody who does that to me, is someone who takes a whole bunch of photos of a whole bunch of things, doesn't know what they're looking at, and instead of going home and figuring it out, they'll come up to me or another birder and go, "Oh, what's this? What's this? What's this? What's this?" as they click through all the photos. I'm like, dude, go home and do your homework. It just makes me crazy.
Yeah.
Consider also, they're while they're out taking those pictures, they're working on framing a picture. They're not really in touch with the bird. And a big part of what's happening live, I think, gets missed.
I agree and I disagree.
That depends. I think that depends on how much of a photographer they are, as opposed to if they're really trying to get a really good photograph of something, then they're doing that. But some of them are not trying to frame the bird. Some of them are doing just what Chris is saying. They're just taking pictures and they're going to identify it afterwards.
I just want to say that I will make a plug here for Tom Stevenson, who many of us, probably all of us know, and probably a lot of the people watching know. And Tom is kind of championing a whole new style of birding, which is birding via camera. It's a way of photographing and being able to not going for the frame, not going for the pretty picture, but going for the documentation and then doing the work at home and looking at it and being able to actually, you might just get a tail feather, you might just get a shot of the undertail, but I don't really understand the whole system. He's writing a book about it, so we'll learn about it. But so that I think these might not just be the people that take a picture of the beautiful waterfall and then turn around and walk away and never even looked at the waterfall, just took a picture of it, kind of thing. So
Chuck, I kind of agree and I disagree with you. I mean, for me, I don't like to take pictures because I like to be in the moment and the experience.
I'm the same way.
That's just my way, yeah, and Jeff too. But you got to remember, with a lot of these youngsters, Anya, they're all about sort of the Instagram generation.
That's true.
Like, if they don't have a photo of it that
It
they
didn't
can put
exist.
on social media, it didn't happen.
Right.
So that's part of the experience for them. No, not the way maybe you or I do it, but that's part of it for them. And then the other thing is, they're not necessarily spending a lot of time to frame up these pictures, because the technology apparently, and I didn't know this because I'm not a photographer, is off the charts. They've actually got programs in these cameras that will lock on to the eye of the bird and track it, so that they don't have to spend time framing it. The technology is doing it for them. So they don't really have to necessarily do a lot of that. So it's interesting. It's different.
I'm with a lot of people. I got a lot of questions after I finished making the film, because I did all the bird photography in the film. I did all the shooting. I was very happy to put my camera down, and that was a movie camera, of course. But people were surprised that I don't. They see me out. They don't have a camera. I'm like Chris. I would rather just experience it. I find when you do bring a camera, it's a whole different experience than. The Tom Stevenson thing notwithstanding, because I haven't really embraced that yet. But
this goes back a long way, and I think it was Plato. There's one of those old Greeks. I'm not
Shadow
sure.
in the Cave.
Was that
with his
Shadow in the
Kodak
Cave.
brownie?
Oh no, we're getting into Plato's allegory of the cave.
Correct.
No, I didn't read that. No, this quote is when writing is starting to be used. And he said, we're going to hell in a handbasket, basically. Our memories will be just dissipated if we start writing this stuff down, because we'll depend on that to store our knowledge. And I noticed that in huge factor with modern electronics. You don't have to learn something, you have to learn which button to push to get it.
Well, I feel that way about Merlin. And I say this as someone who's now, very involved with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which put out Merlin, and it's amazing. And I hate it because it makes me obsolete. I spent years, learning the
Because
hard way.
you were, Chris, even in the film, you're a walking Merlin.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
You and Joe were our Merlins.
Yeah,
what was that? What was that?
Those of us who are earbirders, like Todd Winston is another earbirder. You develop this knowledge, and now Merlin just kind of does it for you, and it makes me grit my teeth. But it has done tremendous things for a lot of birders and new birders particularly, and people who are just getting into birds. They walk out their back door and maybe they've never even thought about birds, and they turn on Merlin and they find out there's 20 different species in their backyard, and they're like, wait, what? Yeah. And it's amazing. So, as much as some of us old timers may be gritting our teeth about these things, I think by and large, technology has been a boon for birding and birders. And Anya has already mentioned eBird. The data, again, another Cornell thing, the data eBird pumps into Cornell allows them to really inform conservation efforts all over the country, if not the world. So I think overall, as much as we gripe, the technology is great. And I even saw some comments in the chat about how, hey, photography is how I got into birding. So, I think overall it's a positive.
I will definitely second both your reluctance and your being impressed with Merlin, because I was very, very reluctant to download Merlin, and I avoided it for years. But I'm also a terrible earbirder. I'm really good. I just have a feel for visual ID, and I just cannot remember sounds. And it's probably because I'm also terrible at music. But I finally caved and downloaded Merlin, and it has finally gotten me to start actually learning bird sounds.
I
so much better than I ever was able to before, because I can. It helps me narrow down what I'm listening to, and then I can actually find the thing I'm listening to and make the connection in my brain.
And I'm embarrassed I never even thought of this. Someone, Elizabeth, just put in the chat that if you have hearing loss, Merlin is a godsend, and I could see that. I could totally see that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Mary Beth made a really nice comment in the chat. I just want to highlight. She said, sounds like there are a few more ways of birding now. And yeah, there's more options.
Yes. Early on in Joe's group, I joked a bit a couple times about needing Joe in a box. We didn't have Merlin yet.
Right.
But I wanted Joe in a box to take when he wasn't there to tell me what that thingy over there was.
Yep, we've got it now.
Yep.
Yeah.
The technology has greatly changed birding, and and as was sort of mentioned a bit earlier, it's changed tremendously bird finding. I mean, the evolution of the information getting out to you in the field has just been unbelievable. I mean, when I started birding, and even long after I was birding, 20, 30 years ago, the current system with WhatsApp and GroupMe and all these others was unthinkable. I remember just when it was considered amazing new technology when we all carried the little walkie-talkies around. We had this. Remember, we had specific channels.
Remember the book in the boathouse, where that was where you recorded everything.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The boathouse.
Speaking of stereo, yeah.
I even remember the book in the boathouse.
Even GPS coordinates. I mean, I've tracked, I've chased rare birds based on coordinates, and I get there and there's no birders around, but I got the coordinates, and so I find the bird. That kind of thing.
But as I say, just going from the walkie-talkies now to the getting the text messages pretty instantly about things. I remember I used to joke about one of the things about Central Park, why you see so many more birds in Central Park was the sheer number of birders and eyes in Central Park. And if anything got found, all you had to do was look up, and listen for the sucking noise of all the birds heading east because the Blackburnian had been seen over that way.
It's so true. No, our word of mouth in Central Park back in the day was actually pretty effective.
Yeah.
I mean, word filtered out fast. Like I remember
Yeah.
when the Swainson's warbler was found up on Strawberry Fields, and everybody knew about that. Like, boom!
Oh, yeah.
Actually, technology had actually started to filter through.
Yeah,
at
that
point.
was partly technology, but that was still before the current text
But-
messaging. It was,
But even before that, word got out, and people. That's one of the beauties of Central Park birding, in my opinion, is that we all share the birds, and it's a very welcoming, very friendly community, in my opinion.
And it's not one of these zero-sum games at all. It does
Mm-mm.
not take away from my experience at all. In fact, in many cases, it's better if you can bring people into it. It makes it more richer.
And it gives you bragging rights. Kevin Topping, for all
absolutely.
eternity, is a god because he found that Kirtland's warbler.
Right.
I can remember a time when it worked against you, Jeff, early on, 10 years ago. And I was up at Belvedere, and you were with a camera crew, I think somewhere south of the lake. And
Something
somebody
about a
was
blue grosbeak.
Yeah, somebody was talking about a blue grosbeak and these two blue-looking birds parked in a tree across from me, and I dialed you up. And you and that poor crew had to lug all that heavy equipment up to find a couple of what
Indigo
were they?
buntings.
Yeah, indigo bunting. After you had
All right.
climbed the mountain and found that technology has a downside.
It's okay. It's the rule of birding. You'd rather be alerted and false alarm than to, oh gee, I forgot to tell you.
if you see something, say something.
Yeah, well, I did. So
Jessica, I know you're trying to move us on here.
I am. This is a great discussion, though. I hate to break in, but we have gotten some questions from participants as you've all been talking. So in our last few minutes, I want to throw some of those at you all. I'll start with a question about technology. Actually, we've talked a lot tonight about how technology has helped birding and made it more accessible. But can you think of ways where technology has hurt birding or has hurt birds?
Yes, definitely.
Glass windows.
That's old technology, though. We've
Yeah.
had glass for how long? I would say where it's hurt is, and I think someone actually alluded to this in the chat, is when people, broadcast the location of owls down to what we were talking about just a second ago, the GPS locations, because they're so easily disturbed, and then they'll go away, and it's not good for the bird. So yeah, I think that's.
And of course,
I'm not going to get
we can all think of a certain individual who walks around broadcasting bird sounds.
I was about to say, I'm not going to get into it. I'm just going to say, as a newer birder who can't handle having sound blast at him when he's in the field, I am not a fan of excessive use of, playback.
Or the
I think
rudeness
that
that accompanies it.
in terms of the sharing locations, I think something that we lose with the reason that's become such an issue is because if you're communicating the location of an owl word to mouth, in doing that, you're part of a community and you sort of establish community norms.
Yeah.
And so even if you're still sharing the location, you sort of develop as a community over time more of an understanding of what the appropriate behavior is. When you send out a text alert about the location of an owl, people hearing about that have not been brought into the community and taught the appropriate way to behave when you receive that information.
Yeah.
And so I think that the problem is
good
not how dare we tell people where owls are, it's the scale and the lack of care.
Dead on, yeah.
Very good.
It's a great point, and it speaks as well to just the increase in birding over the last few years, which is amazing, and I think we all really appreciate that. But it is incumbent upon us to, I think, train the next generation of birders, right, and to build a community around that.
Yes.
And on that point, there was a note earlier about how the pandemic has really caused an explosion in birding. But thinking back to this film 10 years ago, did you see the film itself create more interest in birding?
I don't know if it's attributable to that. I know this aforementioned character who walks around broadcasting. He's gotten a lot more customers. I think that might have partly been that Star died. And unfortunately, that was the, for a lot of people, that was the place to go if you just wanted to show up and bird. I don't know if I mean, anecdotally, people say to me, oh, well, there's so many more birds in the park after your film. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but I know the film has had a lot of impact around not a lot of impact, but it has affected people around the country. It's not just, it is a Central Park film, of course, but it's also a film that's kind of my favorite comment that I get from a lot of people is saying, people thanking, when they realize I made the film, thanking me because they were able to show the film to their husband, and their husband could get it. Even my son, who was about 15 at the time the film came out, said, when he finally saw it, he said, I get it. I understand. I so much better get what you're about now. He's not a birder. He's a naturalist, but he's not a birder.
And how about the rest of you? Did the film change your life or your birding significantly?
I had some fun with it, in that some local teachers would use the film as a teaching tool, and then they would bring their students into the park during spring migration, and then they would see me and they would go, "Oh my God, you're the guy from Central
Better than a
Park."
Blackburnian.
Which was really kind of fun. So that was amusing.
Well, Chris can testify that I've never let him forget his Blackburnian scene in the film. But
The Blackburnian warblers deserve it.
yeah, but one of the reasons I still, after all of these years, I still lead the bird walks is, we're talking about the community. I really enjoy showing birds to people, especially to new birders, and we're just getting into it, and I enjoy showing people their life magnolia warbler or their life black-throated green, and there's nothing. It's very distinctive when you're trying. There's a distinctive sound when you're trying to get somebody on their first scarlet tanager, and when they've spotted it, when you're getting them into this part of the tree, and you suddenly hear that as they see it, and there's just a great thrill for me personally to still be doing that, and I enjoy doing that. That's why I still lead trips.
Yeah.
That bird has to be the opening to the ooh season for that birder. We all go through about a year early on where it's ooh is the only sound we can make every time we see a bird.
I think the beauty of that moment is we as veteran birders, if you want to call us that, we get to re-experience the bird through their eyes.
That's right.
As if we're seeing it for the first time, and that's a thrill.
You only get a light bird once, so you gotta, and to show it to someone else is just like an absolute thrill.
And after 50 years, getting a life bird is a real tough thing.
Right.
In terms of changes with the movie, I lost my anonymity in the park. People started recognizing me and coming up to me.
Sorry about that, Anya.
And I was a pretty antisocial birder. I mentioned I really just kind of went out with one friend, and people would know who I was, and I'd have no idea who they were, and I'd feel very embarrassed.
Yeah, and meanwhile, I get to walk through the park, unidentified. I'm not in the film. My voice is in the film a little bit, but I'm not in the film, so nobody ever stops me. I just made you guys. Made you guys victims, but not me.
I still get that. You're in the bird movie. The people walk up when we see, even me and one other person, and I saw you. We watched it, and they have something to say about the film. But I've never heard anybody say anything bad about it. It's a great film.
Yeah, I remember 10 years ago, my barber saying, "Did I just see you on HBO?"
I remember lots of angry notes on various web pages from like Quakers and things, not Quakers. I think it was Mennonite community or something like that out in Pennsylvania about, what a wonderful movie, except for that one gentleman who had to use that R-rated word. And I was like,
well, that was a big mistake in a sense that I'm glad it was fine to put it on the HBO broadcast, but when I did the DVD version, I don't know why the distributor didn't insist, and I wish they had told me that we're going to lose out on, on school audiences, because what Chris says at the moment, in case anybody doesn't remember the moment, Chris is trying to find a Black Bernie, and he says, if I can only find the Humpty, uses a certain word, and then he turns.
Where is the
then he turns and looks at the camera and says, "You can bleep that," which, if had we bleeped it, it would have been funny. It would have worked. So it was certainly a filmmaking mistake on my part. I've actually shown this film to classrooms, and I would have my hand on the speaker cord, and I would just pull it out. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. It's only one word.
I've done the exact same thing when I've shown it to
Yeah.
grammar school kids.
Yeah, that's my mistake, not Chris's. Chris gave me a perfect entree there when he said, "You can bleep that."
Well, Chris can tell you about my coming up to him in the park with leading a group, and there's a Black Bernian up there, and I say, "Chris, it's a family group now. Be careful."
Well, thank you all so much for spending the time with us tonight. We can't even get to all the questions. We have so many. So clearly there's a lot of interest in the film and it's how it's affected all of you and birding. But Jeff, Chris, Anya, Joe, and Chuck, thank you for sharing your stories and your perspectives. I hope everyone in the audience has been inspired to get out into the park for some birding. As you probably know, New York City Audubon offers hundreds of bird outings annually across the city, and though spring is probably the best time to experience the Central Park effect, the park and other parks around the city are no less beautiful in the winter. So I hope you'll join us for one of our winter programs. You don't have to take your snowshoes like Chuck. You can walk, but snowshoes are optional. My colleague Rosalind Rivas is dropping a link into the Zoom chat right now with a calendar of all of our events and programs. And actually, you can check it now, check it again in a few days. We're going to be putting a whole lot of winter programming up there. A few other things to note is how New York City Audubon is engaging new, younger birders. We now have a young conservationist group, to the point made tonight, seeing a lot of new faces in birding, and we have some great events for that group. In fact, we have a trivia night coming up on December 12th for young conservationists. So if you are among the many, many new birders between the ages of 18 and 35, we'd love for you to join us. And then back to birding in Central Park, we have the Christmas bird count coming up. Jeff Kimball here is going to be leading one of our counts. And so if you sign up for the Christmas bird count on Sunday, December 18th, you might have a chance to bird with Jeff yourself in Central Park. And then one last plug for an Audubon event is our next lecture. So taking a break for the holidays, and then our winter lecture series resumes on January 9th. Conservation ecologist Eric Sanderson will be joining us to talk about his work to map and tell the story of New York City's ecological landscape before European settlers arrived. And Rosalind is dropping the link for that lecture into the chat right now. We'll also be sending all this information out in an email that you'll receive in the next few days. That also includes a link to the recording for tonight, and we encourage you to watch it again, watch the film again, of course, and get out there and bird.
And the front page, there are many free ways to watch the film, which is on the I think it was on the announcement, so there are ways to see the film.
Right, and we'll share those links again so y'all can watch that.
And a hand for Jeff for making the film in the first place.
Yeah. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us tonight. I hope to see you in one of these online events or birding in the park soon. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Rosalind.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.